back to Pretoria and the trial of the athlete Oscar Pistorius. And our regular guest and legal expert, Brenda Wardle, joins us live. Brenda, how unusual is it for a complete news blackout of evidence was today's events?
Well, Heather, it's absolutely unusual because normally what happens in courts in South Africa is that members of the print and even the electronic media would come in and attend trials which are held in public and essentially report on them, whether they tweet or whether they paraphrase and reduce them to articles in newspapers. However, when we arrived after lunch, one of the media groupings wanted clarification because they didn't understand this blanket ban on everything about Professor Simon. But then the judge said, no, you are allowed to paraphrase, which was a distinct departure from what she had said earlier. So you can paraphrase and you can go ahead and publish.
Nevertheless, it is being reported. I mean, direct quotes are being reported on Twitter. Is there likely to be any penalty as a result of that?
Well, the sanctioning of any crime or delict on the internet, the question of jurisdiction comes up. So if somebody reports in London and they violate an order or they are guilty of contempt in a court in South Africa, where would you actually prosecute that? I doubt that there will be any sanctions that will follow, but the judge was concerned, or even Advocate Nell was concerned, about the fact that people were quoting Professor Simon verbatim, which is something that he had expressly stated he didn't want to happen at the start of the proceedings.
Why do you think he said that? Because, you know, in other cases where the victim has met a violent end, I'm reminded of Anine Boyson's, all those very graphic details were reported. Why do you think it was different for Reeva Steenkamp?
You see, it goes back to the right to equality and how different people are treated differently. Because, I mean, Anine Boyson's murder, the rape, it was even more gruesome than that of Reeva Steenkamp. But none of that was actually advanced. And there are still images all over the internet. So I thought that was a bit problematic because they report 2 weeks ago there was a mutilation for Muti murder of a lady, and those graphic images were published in the print media.
Let's go back to the court itself and Oscar Pistorius and his reaction. Quite unprecedented, isn't it?
Well, he has been reacting in that way, obviously not retching previously. He would just bury his head in his hands and close off his ears. Initially, I thought this would have been the worst day for Oscar Pistorius. But when we went back after lunch, I wasn't sure whether some of that is not even feigned, because when the forensic pathologist said he's on the last page of his pathologist report, then Oscar suddenly sat up, and then when more gruesome details were being discussed, he went back down again, making those sounds as though he's nauseated, vomiting, etc., etc. I don't know. I just hope it is sincere.
Of course, the only person who really it counts is the judge. So if he were giving a performance, it would only be to the judge, wouldn't it be?
It would be. That is the demeanor of the witness or the accused person. That is for the judge, assisted by the assessors, to basically decide.
How damaging do you think the revelation of the kinds of bullets that were used to kill Reeva Steenkamp, how damaging do you think it is to his case?
I think a lot of what was said by Professor Simon was damaging, especially that bullet. The fact that it opened up like petals and then it had jagged edges and it was dangerous. And the devastation that it causes to tissue, as he basically described that. over and above that, the fact of when last she had a meal, etc., etc. So Professor Simon coming across very, very strongly, and also defining the injuries, where he says that the bullet that hit her the parietal area of her scalp, would actually have incapacitated her almost immediately, and that bullet wouldn't have entered at that angle unless she was actually couched or bent over.
Barbara Wardle in South Africa, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Good night.
Brenda Wardle, our legal expert, and we can try and sort of unpick some of the what happened in court today. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Brenda. Why do you think they're spending so much time on the lesser charges?
Well, Debbie, I'm not quite sure why Gerinel keeps going back to the lesser charges, except, of course, if he's trying to bring in through the back door character evidence to show that Oscar Pistorius is prone to violence. We must remember that Darren Fresco is a Section 204 witness, meaning that if he tells the truth and the whole truth, he'll be exempt from prosecution or he'll be granted immunity. And that would be, and he gave evidence on counts 2 and 3.
Yes, he received the Section 204 immunity from prosecution for his testimony. So why wasn't he more forthcoming? Because he kept on saying, I don't know, I don't remember.
Well, what I found, in my observation, Darren Fresco was saying all the things that would be inculpatory for Oscar Pistorius and exculpatory for himself, because it was clear. I mean, Barry Rue was meticulous today. He honed in on him. He tried to tell him that you deposed to an affidavit. The initial statement didn't include allegations or averments that Oscar Pistorius had actually asked you to lie for him, etc., etc. But he was less than candid. And there's a standard which is set out in Section 204 of our Criminal Procedure Act. But if one goes back to another high-profile case we had in South Africa, which was the Brett Kebbel case and the attempted murder charge on Stephen Mildenhall, then Clint Nassif was torn apart by SC holders saying you're a liar, you are deceptive, and yet he was granted immunity. Because you must remember the prosecution applies to court, for court at the end of the trial to decide whether or not the witness was honest enough and gave enough evidence in order for that immunity then to stand. But it's not immunity that is granted a priori or from the onset.
So is that the reason, do you think, that when Mr. Fresco decided that he was going to give evidence, he went to see a lawyer to make sure that he didn't incriminate himself?
Yes, and that is not what he should do, because he should have been forthright even about his own involvement, because that immunity is granted whether or not he implicates himself. Section 35 of our Constitution is the rights of detained and arrested persons. He has a right to remain silent, and that is why the judge at the commencement prior to him testifying had to warn him that some of your answers may be incriminatory. But he just didn't take the court into its confidence, and he tried to apportion all the blame onto Oscar Pistorius.
Do you think he succeeded?
He didn't succeed, because Barry Rue saw right through that and poked holes into his testimony.
Barbara Wardle in Pretoria, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Let's return now to South Africa, where the 8th day of the Oscar Pistorius trial has adjourned. Legal analyst Brenda Wardle was there, and she joins us now. Brenda, are we getting more of a sense of the defence's case as Barry Rue took apart Colonel Vermeulen's evidence?
Well, I actually think that it was a bad day for the South African criminal justice system, because remember that I don't think that Oscar Pistorius is the only one on trial here. The entire world has its eyes set on South Africa. And for a colonel who's just been promoted, he used to be a lieutenant colonel, after he started the investigations, to make so many mistakes, to make such concessions under cross-examination, tampered evidence, why Gerinel even led him is absolutely beyond me. But there's a very, very uncomfortable pattern that is developing in this case.
Now, would the contamination of the crime scene, poorly executed forensics, be enough to create the reasonable doubt that the defence needs?
Well, all Gerinel has to do, and perhaps even after consulting with the defense, is just to exclude the tampered evidence, because the objective facts of this case are that Riva Steenkamp was killed. We know that Oscar Pistorius has said he fired the 4 shots. So whether or not he was 1.5 meters from the bathroom door, on his stumps, off his stumps, which direction he shot from, that is not important. What the court needs to establish, firstly, based on the objective facts, is whether Riva Steenkamp screamed. If she did scream, Oscar Pistorius heard her, and therefore that is basically the end of the case. But you cannot go and present evidence knowing that it has been tampered with. And the manner that it's being done by police officials with in excess of 21 years in the service, to me, that was just shocking. Those were shocking revelations.
Now, what about the forensics that were discussed that seem to indicate that the cricket bat was used after the gun was fired? Will that help the defence?
Well, that is what Pistorius has held anyway, that he first shot through the door, then he went at the door with the cricket bat to try and open it. Today we heard that he even tried to kick down the door with his prosthesis. Obviously, Colonel Vermeulen saying he doesn't believe there could have been other possibilities. But the whole scenario today would actually just work in Oscar Pistorius' favor. But I'm saying that there are other objective facts that need to be looked at over and above the cricket bat, the door, etc., because obviously that evidence is virtually worth 0 at this stage.
Brenda Wardle, live in Pretoria. Thanks very much indeed. Oscar Pistorius on the 9th day of testimony. Now, the judge was shown graphic photographs of the Pistorius villa and of the injuries suffered by his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. Now, Brenda Wardle is a South African legal analyst, and she's been following the story. Brenda, what do you think was the most significant revelation for you in court today?
Good afternoon, Heather. I think the most significant revelation today was that even on the main bedroom door, I don't know whether it was a bullet hole, but there was damage done to the door itself, and nothing was explained about that. And I think the criticism I still have of Gerinel is that we are shown all these exhibits in court and all this evidence, but he fails to bring about that nexus between the evidence and the charges which are in the indictment, for example, by making them relevant to some of the facts that are in the charge sheet. But I mean, I was astounded by the fact that there would actually have been marks on the door itself, and the curtains were wide open in the photographs. The SAPS, or former SAPS commissioner of the Boshoff police station, saying that is how the windows were open in the bedroom, the blinds were open, the door was open, and the curtains were open.
And that would go completely against Oscar Pistorius' testimony, where he said it was dark in the room and he couldn't see, and he just, he couldn't see whether or not he thought that Riva was in bed next to him because it was dark.
Yes. Yes, he said he came back from the balcony, closed the sliding door, closed the blinds, drew the curtains, heard the noise and went for the gun. And yet the room was absolutely dark. But he then says in his affidavit in support of bail that he basically saw that the bathroom window was open. Now, how he could see that from a vantage point of a pitch black room or very dark room, as he puts it, is still a mystery. The other problem, and this hasn't been picked up at all by anyone that I have, today they switched off the monitor in front of Oscar Pistorius because I think he opted not to see some of the images. Now, the problem we have is that in South Africa, obviously, included in the right to a fair trial is the right to challenge and adduce evidence. And in certain instances, we've had accused persons go to higher courts, for example, the Supreme Court of Appeal, and argue inadequate legal representation. Now, if Oscar Pistorius chooses which images he is going to look at, when he is going to bury his head in his lap or block out even his ears, because it's not Barry Rue who's on trial here, it's Oscar Pistorius, and that might raise procedural issues at a later stage. And I think the judge should actually step in and basically insist that he faces the images, however gruesome they might be, and all the evidence, because at the end he has to answer to the case.
When you say procedural rules it might bring up, what kind of procedural issues could it bring up?
Let's look at the worst case scenario and say Oscar Pistorius is found guilty of murder, and he then decides, I'm going to change my legal team and not go with Barry Rue. And this is just a far-fetched assumption on my side. Immediately he does that, the next attorneys or legal team could come in and say, well, Oscar, you didn't even see some of these images. At material times during the trial, you were so emotional that you didn't even see them. And then, I mean, you can't bring a judge's conviction, for example, under review. You can only appeal against it. And if there are irregularities, you have to file what is called a special entry of irregularity. But I think it's something even the state needs to start addressing, that it is very important for Oscar to be aware of all the accusations that are leveled against him and also know all the exhibits that are being handed in court.
Now, he was vomiting again today. You've seen a lot of court cases in a country which is, in many ways violent. Have you ever seen an accused behave in such a visceral way before?
No, not ever. Not in my professional history, never even. Just hearing about it, it's the first time that we have witnessed that.
Do you think the judge might take a dim view of what he's doing, the vomiting, the retching? Can she order him not to vomit?
Well, I think she's, Judge Masipa is a very, very soft judge. I see the way she, even when he was retching violently on the first day, that she was very concerned, and she said, but Mr. Rue, Mr. Pistorius, it's important that he follows the case. And, Barry Rue looked a bit irritable at that stage and said, well, my lady, it's going to get worse. We have actually prepared him. So I don't think so. When it comes down to his demeanor, I don't think she would judge him too harshly, because looking at all the facts, it is an emotional thing for any person to actually go through.
Brenda Wardle, live in Pretoria, thanks very much indeed for joining us. The 10th day of the Oscar Pistorius murder trial. Brenda Wardle is a South African legal analyst, and she's been in court today and joins us now from Pretoria. Brenda, at the end of week 2, it's really the South African police service who's been in the dock as much as Oscar Pistorius.
Absolutely, Heather. I think they are in the line of fire, if I could actually put it that way. And our Supreme Court of Appeal in the State versus Spiss just set down the test for instances where there is interference, and they basically say that one must actually differentiate between pre-trial prejudice, that is during the investigation stage, what police do at the investigation stage, as opposed to what they do after the prosecution has already been initiated. Now, we heard from Colonel Vermeulen this week that he stumbled upon the version of Oscar Pistorius in an office at the High Court, supposedly when he was meeting with Advocate Gerinel. He didn't really study it. He just looked at Oscar's version, cursory glanced at that. So that could actually be viewed as post trial or prejudice that occurs during the trial. But I'm sure Barry Roux is going to have a field day if more police officers come, and we'll have to play it by ear.
What do you think the reason is that this particular investigation, given how much the spotlight was on South Africa, what would be a reason for it to be bungled so badly?
I certainly do not know. I said earlier on in an interview this afternoon that perhaps this was actually done deliberately, because if you look at the levels in the police force of the members who've actually done the bungling, stealing of Oscar Pistorius's wristwatches when only the forensics teams were inside the house at that particular stage, getting someone who specializes in ammunition, who's a ballistics expert, going in there, glove dangling from his pocket, not doing the right thing. Hilton Botha going and putting a stamp after the affidavit of Dr. Johan Stip, and when he didn't even take the statement from the doctor. So it's just too much. It's just too coincidental. So I don't know. I just suspect that it was done deliberately.
But for what reason would they do it deliberately?
I really don't know, and perhaps the more police officers testify, the more the picture is going to become clearer. Because if you look at witnesses such as Professor Simon, it was clear from Professor Simon, you could see that the integrity, his credibility, Dr. Johan Stip, and then you have members of the police force coming to testify, and you can tell from the beginning that things are going to be awry under cross-examination. And my suspicion is that Barry Roux, at the end of the state's case, is going to invoke the provisions of Section 174 of our Criminal Procedure Act and basically say, my lady, there has been tampering, the manner in which the door was handled, the cricket bat, securing of the scene, closing off of the doors outside. Clearly there was tampering there too. And my client is then entitled to a discharge.
Do you think that the kinds of issues that have been raised in this particular trial will have far-reaching implications for the South African Police Service and the judicial system?
Well, it would have far-reaching implications for our police service, because remember that tampering with a crime scene in itself is an offense that should be investigated. I think people who, the Ministry of Safety and Security, who is in charge of our police services, should actually not take a dim view. I mean, we've got the Diwanis who do not want to come to South Africa, who raise all sorts of issues about our prison system, our justice system, etc., and they must be sitting back, his legal team must be sitting back and saying, can you see what is actually happening in South Africa?
They've probably got Barry Roux on speed dial. Brenda Wardle, thanks very much indeed for joining us.